The tranquil village of Little Hinton, tucked into the rolling hills of the English countryside, had always been a place of gentle rhythms. The residents moved through their days with a comfortable familiarity, mornings greeted by the song of robins perched on windowsills, afternoons spent tending gardens or chatting over cups of tea, and evenings with the slow burn of wood stoves crackling against the evening chill. A place where time seemed to stretch a little longer than in the bustling towns beyond, where lives ran in parallel lines, never disturbed by the interruptions of the wider world. Every year the Harvest Festival was the event that broke the quiet monotony. It was held in the village hall, the old building with a steep roof and ivy creeping up its stone walls, its windows always glinting warmly by evening light. On this particular autumn evening, the hall was dressed in garlands of golden leaves, straw bales stacked near the entryway, and the delicious aroma of spiced cider wafting through the air. The villagers gathered in good spirits, dressed in their best, eagerly anticipating the performance of the last act, the annual play performed by the Amateur Dramatic Society. The play had been a long-time tradition, bringing together local talents and causing much excitement among the villagers. This year, the leading role of the play was held by Richard Cleary, a tall, charismatic man who had moved to Little Hinton only a few years earlier. Despite his relative newness to the village, Richard had become a central figure in the community, an accomplished actor, a confident leader in the local amateur theater group, and a well-liked guest at the various social events the village offered. Tonight he was to play the hero in the final, intense scene of the play, where he would confront his villainous counterpart. As the curtains rose, the audience settled in, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Richard stood at the center of the stage, his costume perfectly tailored, his features set in a dramatic grimace. The other actors flanked him, their faces a blend of tension and excitement. The final scene was a much-anticipated one, a climactic confrontation that had the audience on the edge of their seats. Then, as the play reached its peak, something truly unsettling happened. As Richard, in his character's final moment, faced his antagonist, a fellow actor dressed in black, ready for the dramatic finale, he collapsed. At first, the audience remained silent, thinking it was part of the performance. But then came the sickening realization that this was not part of the show. The body of Richard Cleary remained still, motionless on the stage. His fellow actors froze in their positions, unsure of how to react. The audience, too, was unsure whether they were witnessing an elaborate trick or something far more serious. A scream cut through the uneasy silence. It was Mrs. Delilah Sims, the village baker, who had been sitting near the front. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "He's dead! He's dead!" she cried out, her voice ringing through the hall like an unwelcome bell. The words seemed to snap the villagers into action. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. As people rushed forward, some trying to help, others retreating in fear, their faces ashen with shock. The actors scattered, some fainting, others looking helplessly at each other. The village constable, who had been attending the event immediately, stepped forward, his face hardening as he surveyed the scene. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice sharp. "This is not part of the play. Everyone, please remain calm. We need to clear the area and assess the situation." Miss Jane Marple, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the hall, observing the play with her usual sharp eyes, now found herself at the heart of the unfolding crisis. As the police and bystanders moved about in confusion, Miss Marple remained still. Her gray eyes scanned the scene, unfazed by the sudden chaos that gripped the hall. She had seen this kind of thing before, the shock, the disbelief, the swirling rush of emotions that clouded rational thought. Her mind was already working through the possibilities, even as the police began their initial investigation. The play had been a simple affair, a community gathering, and there was nothing about the evening that would have seemed out of place until now. She slowly stood, her cane capping softly against the floor as she made her way toward the stage, her gaze never leaving the body of Richard Cleary. The village reacts The aftermath of the incident spread quickly, as it always did in a village of Little Hinton's size. Word of the tragedy reached the farthest corners of the community in mere minutes, and by the time the police had begun their inquiries, the gossip had already taken root. "I told you something was wrong," Mrs. Sims murmured to anyone within earshot. "That man, Richard, he'd been acting strange all week. He was nervous, jumpy. I should have known it wasn't just the play." Yes, Mr. Archibald Green, a retired Army officer and longtime friend of Richard's, added with an air of defensiveness. Richard wasn't the type to faint on stage. Something else must have happened. Maybe it was a heart attack. He had a lot of stress lately. With his new project in the city, you know how it is. Heart attack? Mrs. Florence Dobbins, a local busybody who had been sitting near the front row, countered with a scoff. If it was a heart attack, why was he still standing upright? Look at his face. There's no color. I bet he was poisoned. The theories piled up one after another, each villager offering their own explanation for the tragedy, but none of them seemed to reach any conclusions. The more the villagers speculated, the more Miss Marple withdrew into her own thoughts. She had been watching the scene unfold, and there were details that others missed, things too subtle to be noticed in the rush of confusion. At the back of the hall, the police were speaking to the actors, trying to gather any information they could about Richard's behavior in the days leading up to the event. The constable, a tall man with a stubbled chin, turned to the stagehand, who had been closest to Richard during the final act. "Did you notice anything strange before he collapsed?" the constable asked. The young woman, her face pale and shaky, wrung her hands nervously. He was fine just before. I saw him backstage before the curtain went up. He was talking to the director, Mr. Porter, but he didn't look unwell. He was laughing, joking. He didn't seem upset at all? Did he take anything before the play? The constable pressed. A drink? A pill? Did he eat anything unusual? The young woman shook her head. No, nothing. He was just acting normal. The constable nodded slowly, looking around at the others. Well, we'll have to wait for the doctor to arrive before we can say anything for certain. But it's clear something went wrong up there. We'll get to the bottom of it. Miss Marple, who had been listening intently to the exchange, couldn't help but notice the faintest of shifts in the young woman's expression. A brief hesitation, an uncertain glance as she looked away from the constable. It was subtle, but it was there. Early investigation, Miss Marple moved towards the stage, her feet light but deliberate. She bent over the body of Richard Cleary, taking a moment to observe the scene that had left the entire village rattled. The other officers were distracted, speaking to witnesses, but Miss Marple's sharp eye immediately picked up on the smallest details. The blood stain on Richard's costume was not large, but it was certainly noticeable. The fabric was a deep crimson, soaking through the pristine white of his shirt. And there, just beneath the blood, was a faint indentation in the fabric, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A mark that seemed to suggest pressure had been applied to the chest just before the collapse. Miss Marple glanced up at the villagers, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. None of them were looking at the details. They were consumed with their theories, poison, heart attack, stress, but Miss Marple knew better. She moved slowly around the body, noting the subtle angle at which Richard had fallen. His face was peaceful, but there was an unnatural stillness to his features. This wasn't the chaotic final moments of a man who had been suddenly struck down. No, this was the calculated end of someone who had been waiting for this moment. A whisper of a memory flickered in Miss Marple's mind, an observation, one that others would have dismissed, but one she couldn't ignore, a brief glance. A sudden shift in posture before the collapse. Could it be that Richard had known exactly what was coming? As she took in the details, Miss Marple's mind began to piece together a story. The question was no longer if it was murder, but how? And why? The village may not have known it yet, but they had just witnessed the first act of a much darker drama. And Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to untangle its threads. The village hall was abuzz with a frenetic energy that was entirely out of place in the sleepy confines of Little Hinton. The constable, a wiry man named George Howarth, was trying to maintain some semblance of order, his face flushed with exertion as he shouted instructions to the villagers and officers alike. Meanwhile, Miss Marple stood to one side, observing the scene with quiet detachment. She was the picture of composure, her gray dress simple yet dignified, her cane resting lightly against the floor and her keen eyes ever watchful. A crowd had gathered at the back of the hall, many of them looking both stunned and anxious, while a few muttered nervously under their breath. Mrs. Sims, the baker, continued her ongoing commentary, her voice rising above the others. Poison, I tell you. It had to be poison. The man was perfectly fine just minutes before. A quick sip of something from his glass, and now look at him. Poison? Mr. Archibald Green scoffed, a frown creasing his brow. He was a stout man, with a clipped military tone that could easily be mistaken for arrogance. The man was an athlete. Never had a day of ill health in his life. It wasn't poison. Must have been something else. A seizure, perhaps. He was under a lot of stress lately, you know. New job in the city, all that talk about big money. Well, if you ask me, said Mrs. Florence Dobbins, wringing her hands in distress, he was too nervous. It was all that pressure from the play. He was the lead, after all. It must have overwhelmed him. The village constable was becoming visibly frustrated with the growing speculation, his voice rising to try and regain control. Everyone, please, one at a time, he ordered. We'll get to the bottom of this. First, we need to speak with everyone who was near Mr. Cleary when he collapsed. As the constable turned his attention back to the group of actors, Miss Marple took another step closer to the stage. She was well aware that the police would begin with the most obvious answers, a heart attack, poison, a fatal accident. But she knew, from the steady beat of her instincts, that there was more at play here than mere misfortune. Early investigation, the body of Richard Cleary was still on the stage, now covered with a simple white sheet that did little to shield it from the intense scrutiny of the villagers. The faint smell of alcohol from the nearby refreshment table mingled with the metallic tang of blood, the reality of the situation beginning to settle in like a heavy fog. Miss Marple approached the constable. She had already been watching the scene unfold from the moment of the collapse, and she could sense the unease emanating from the man. He was trying to do his duty, but he was out of his depth. The amateur detectives in the village were no help either. Theories bounced around like errant confetti, with no one daring to venture beyond the superficial explanations. Constable Howarth, Miss Marple said in her calm, measured tone. The constable turned to her, his eyes momentarily wide as, if unsure of how to address her. Yes, Miss Marple? I think it would be best if we all took a moment to breathe and assess the situation logically, she suggested, her voice soft but firm. You've already begun the questioning, but I'm afraid you may have missed a few key details. It might be worth considering that this was no accident. How do you mean, Miss Marple? The constable asked, a note of confusion in his voice. She glanced back at the stage, then slowly moved closer to the body. Look at how he fell. There's no sign of the typical spasms you'd expect from someone who suddenly collapses from a medical condition. His body is still in a rather controlled position for someone who had just suffered a fatal blow. The constable hesitated, clearly struggling to process her words. I don't understand. Are you saying this wasn't an accident? I believe, Miss Marple began carefully, that this may have been an act, or rather, premeditated and designed to appear like an accident. The constable blinked at her in disbelief. You mean someone meant to kill him? Miss Marple's eyes never wavered as she met his gaze. I'm afraid so. The constable opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked back at the body, and then at Miss Marple again, his thoughts clearly in turmoil. First suspects, as Miss Marple remained on the sidelines, observing the ongoing investigations, the police began speaking to the actors and crew members who had been closest to Richard. His fellow performers were visibly shaken, their faces pale and drawn, each of them struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. One by one, the actors were questioned, though none had much to add beyond the basic facts of the night's performance. None of them had noticed anything unusual about Richard's behavior before the collapse, and all had been too focused on their own lines and cues to see anything out of the ordinary during the final moments. But one actor, a young woman named Lydia Williams, seemed more nervous than the rest. She was a striking figure with bright blonde hair and wide blue eyes, but her hands shook as she held them together in front of her chest, and she seemed to stop glancing around the room as if searching for someone or something. Lydia was the only person who had been directly interacting with Richard in the moments before his collapse. She had been playing the role of his lover in the play's final scene, and their characters were supposed to share a passionate exchange just before his dramatic demise. The constable, eager to understand more, turned to Lydia, his voice softening. "Lydia, what happened just before Richard fell?" Lydia's lip trembled slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor. He seemed fine. He was smiling, making a joke with me, saying how we'd finally finished the play and that we could all relax. It was normal. He didn't show any signs of illness, and then, during the scene, he just collapsed. I thought it was part of the act. But when I looked down at him, her voice trailed off, her eyes wide as she shook her head. I knew something was wrong. The look in his eyes, it wasn't acting, it was real. Her words hung in the air like a confession, and Miss Marple couldn't help but note the girl's anxiety. It wasn't unusual for someone in Lydia's position to feel distressed by the sudden death of a co-star, but Miss Marple felt something more beneath her words. Something was being hidden, carefully veiled behind her feigned innocence. Lydia caught Miss Marple's eye, and for a moment her face flushed with something akin to recognition, or perhaps fear. "I'm sorry, but I need to speak to the constable," Lydia muttered, excusing herself and quickly slipping away. Miss Marple watched her leave, her mind racing. There was more to Lydia's reaction than met the eye, but what? A sense of foreboding lingered as Miss Marple turned her attention back to the investigation. A hidden clue. As the night wore on, the police moved about the hall, speaking to the villagers, taking statements, and attempting to piece together a timeline of events. The more Miss Marple observed, the more she was convinced of one thing. The key to this mystery lay not in the facts that were being presented, but in the subtle nuances that had been overlooked by others. It was during this quiet reflection that Miss Marple spotted something unusual. As she moved through the hall, she came across a small, inconspicuous envelope that had been tucked behind a flower pot on one of the side tables. The envelope was slightly crumpled, its contents barely visible from the outside. Miss Marple's fingers brushed gently over the paper, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of her lips. She had found the first piece of the puzzle. Opening it carefully, she peered inside. The note was short, hastily written in a hand she didn't recognize, but it was clear enough. "Meet me in the garden after the play. We must talk before it's too late." The words were chilling, especially when coupled with the knowledge that Richard had been dead before the night's final curtain had even fallen. The mystery was deepening, and Miss Marple knew she was only just beginning to untangle the threads that would reveal the true nature of Richard Cleary's death. Confrontations and secrets. The evening wore on, but the buzz of activity in the village hall showed no signs of abating. Though the performance was long over, the ripple effects of Richard Cleary's sudden death were still very much alive. The air, thick with nervous energy, seemed to pull every villager into its grasp. Some whispered in clusters, others wandered aimlessly, eyes glazed in shock, while the police worked tirelessly to contain the chaos. Miss Marple, however, stood apart from the commotion. As always, she observed with a quiet intensity that few could match. Her eyes darted between the villagers and the officers, studying their body language, the small gestures they made when they thought no one was watching. She had already discovered more than most realized, but she was far from finished. It was, as she stood by the refreshment table, her fingers lightly tapping her cane against the floor, that she saw the first of the confrontations. Lydia Williams, the young actress who had seemed so nervous earlier, was now in a heated discussion with Mr. Porter, the director of the play. Their voices were low, but the anger between them was palpable. You shouldn't have done it. Lydia was hissing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I didn't have a choice, Mr. Porter replied, his tone sharp but restrained. It was the only way to make it work. Miss Marple moved closer, her steps soft as she edged closer to the pair. Their words, though hushed, were clear enough. You promised. You said it would be quick, that no one would know, Lydia pressed, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. I told you I couldn't let him walk away. Not after what he did. Stop, just stop. Lydia's voice cracked as she looked around nervously, making sure no one was listening. She lowered her voice again. What if someone finds out? What if this all comes crashing down? Mr. Porter's expression hardened. We won't let that happen. You just have to trust me. Everything will be fine. The two of them stood. There for a moment, the tension thick between them. Then, just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, Lydia seemed to break. She turned away abruptly. Rushing past Miss Marple without a glance, her face flushed with anger and guilt. Miss Marple allowed the moment to pass, her thoughts swirling. She had heard enough to piece together a portion of the puzzle. There was something more to Lydia's involvement than simple nervousness. The young woman was hiding something, and it seemed that Mr. Porter, the director, knew more about Richard's death than he was letting on. Miss Marple continued to observe Porter for a while longer. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at the stage with a contemplative look, as though deep in thought. But Miss Marple knew better. There was a coldness to his posture, an air of control that made her suspect that he had a far deeper role in this tragedy than the simple task of guiding amateur actors through a play. The unlikely alliance. The next development came when Miss Marple noticed a figure slip quietly through the side door of the hall, keeping to the shadows. It was Mrs. Delilah Sims, the outspoken baker who had been one of the first to declare that Richard had been poisoned. She moved quickly, purposefully, as though she were avoiding the prying eyes of the others. Intrigued, Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps soft and measured. Delilah headed toward the back garden, the same place where Richard's final note had mentioned meeting someone. As she reached the garden's entrance, Miss Marple quickened her pace, careful not to make a sound. Delilah stood by the small stone bench, her eyes scanning the area around her, though her nervous fidgeting was enough to reveal her unease. She glanced over her shoulder before she spoke, almost as if to reassure herself that no one was following. Are you sure it's going to work? Delilah's voice was tight with apprehension. I told you, everything will be fine. We've taken all the necessary precautions, came a voice from the shadows. The speaker stepped into the faint light of the garden. It was Mr. Green, the retired military officer who had been Richard's close friend. His face was grim, his posture rigid, and he spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Delilah turned to him, her face pinched with anxiety. What if someone gets suspicious? What if the police find out what really happened? Don't worry, Mr. Green reassured her, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. They won't find anything. This was the only way. He was getting too close to the truth, Delilah. He had to be stopped. Delilah hesitated, her hands trembling, as she clasped them in front of her. But what about Lydia? She saw something. What if she talks? We've already taken care of Lydia, Mr. Green said, his voice dark with finality. She won't be a problem. Miss Marple could hardly believe what she was hearing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the whole picture was still obscured by shadow. Lydia's involvement, the tension with Mr. Porter, Delilah's apparent guilt, and now the ominous words from Mr. Green. Everything pointed to something far more sinister than a simple accident. Miss Marple was no fool. She knew that in small towns like Little Hinton, secrets had a way of festering in the dark corners, and the longer they were hidden, the more dangerous they became. These people, Delilah, Mr. Green, Mr. Porter, and Lydia, were all part of something. But what, and how did Richard Cleary fit into it all? The turning point. Miss Marple was deep in thought when a sudden noise broke her concentration. She turned just in time to see Constable Howarth and his men moving toward the garden. The constable had a furrowed brow, his lips set in a tight line as he approached Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I'm afraid I have to ask you to step aside, he said, his voice strained. We're going to need to clear the area. The doctor's on his way, and we need to secure the crime scene. Miss Marple's gaze never left the constable's face, though she could see that he was becoming increasingly frustrated. His earlier composure was slipping. The weight of the situation was becoming too much for him to bear, and Miss Marple knew that if they didn't solve this soon, it would only get worse. I understand, Constable, Miss Marple said softly, her voice betraying none of the urgency she felt inside. But I believe you may have missed something. The constable looked at her, his brow knitting further in confusion. What do you mean? I believe you are overlooking the most important clue of all, Miss Marple continued, her tone deliberate. And I have a feeling it's hiding in plain sight. The revelation looms. The constable blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard by Miss Marple's sudden certainty. She had always been a quiet, unassuming figure in the village, never one to thrust herself into the center of events. But something about her calm demeanor and sharp observations seemed to command his attention. Miss Marple, what are you saying? He asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Miss Marple glanced toward the darkening sky, her mind racing through the pieces of the puzzle she had gathered. It was all falling into place now, the hidden note, the secretive conversations, the lies. She knew who had orchestrated this tragedy. But there was still one final thing she needed to uncover. I'm saying, she began, her voice soft, but unwavering, that this crime wasn't just a moment of passion. It was a carefully planned act, designed to look like something it wasn't. And the person behind it was someone who thought they could hide the truth. The constable's gaze narrowed. Who? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with the knowledge she had yet to reveal. The answer lies with the one who had the most to gain. And I think we both know who that is. As the final pieces of the mystery slipped into place, Miss Marple felt a surge of satisfaction. The puzzle was almost complete. The killer, so sure of their own scheme, had underestimated the one thing they could not control, her ability to see through the shadows. The mystery was on the verge of being solved, but the final confrontation, the moment of revelation, was still to come. The air outside the village hall had grown heavy with an unsettling chill as dusk settled in, casting a silvery hue over the little town of Little Hinton. The garden was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant murmur of the gathering crowd still swarming inside the hall. Miss Marple stood in the shadows, her mind racing through the tangled web of clues she had gathered over the past few hours. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the full picture was still unclear. Each step forward only seemed to raise more questions. She watched as Constable Howarth and his men scoured the garden. The doctor's arrival imminent, yet they seemed no closer to understanding the true nature of Richard Cleary's death. The constable's face was drawn, his eyes tired but resolute. He had dismissed the more obvious theories of a heart attack or poisoning, but the pieces Miss Marple had gathered were pointing toward something much more complex. As Miss Marple observed, a small figure moved quickly through the garden, slipping between the bush and trees, trying to avoid being seen. It was Lydia Williams, the young actress who had been at the center of the first confrontation with Mr. Porter. Her eyes darted nervously as she glanced over her shoulder, her footsteps quick and uneven. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Lydia had been acting strangely ever since the moment of Richard's collapse. Her nervousness was palpable, and now she seemed to be trying to avoid being seen. Miss Marple had suspected that Lydia knew more than she was letting on, but the question was, what exactly was she hiding? Without hesitation, Miss Marple followed. She moved swiftly but quietly, using the garden's shadows to her advantage. Always keeping a careful distance behind Lydia, the young woman made her way toward the farthest corner of the garden, where a small wooden shed stood, its door slightly ajar. Lydia glanced around once more before slipping inside. Miss Marple waited for a moment, then approached the shed. She knew Lydia wasn't aware of her presence, and now was the perfect time to uncover what the young woman was so desperately trying to hide. As she neared the shed, Miss Marple pushed the door open slowly, just enough to peer inside. She could see Lydia standing near the back of the small room, her back to the door. Her arms were trembling as she rummaged through a box of old costumes and props, clearly searching for something. Miss Marple's instincts told her that this wasn't merely a search for forgotten items. It was something far more deliberate. "What are you looking for, Lydia?" Miss Marple's voice broke the silence like a gentle nudge, but it was enough to make Lydia freeze in place. Lydia turned quickly, her eyes wide with shock. She stumbled backward, knocking over a pile of props in the process. "Miss Marple," she gasped, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the shed, her eyes never leaving Lydia's face. "You seem to be in quite a hurry." Lydia's face flushed with a mixture of fear and frustration. She bit her lip, as if considering whether to speak or not. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you think you know, but I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Lydia said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted him to die." Miss Marple regarded her quietly, her expression unreadable. "Tell me what happened, Lydia," she said gently. "You don't need to be afraid of me. You're not the first person to get caught in a web of deceit. But if you tell the truth now, it may be the only way out." Lydia's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the box, her gaze downcast. "It was supposed to be just a warning," she said, her voice trembling. "Richard had found out about the plan. He was getting too close to the truth. And when Mr. Porter found out, he told me I had to stop him. But I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted him to leave it alone. So I... Miss Marple watched Lydia closely, her heart sinking as the young woman's words confirmed her suspicions. Lydia's involvement was not merely a matter of nervousness. She had been complicit in something far more dangerous. "I was supposed to meet Richard in the garden, to warn him," Lydia continued, her voice barely audible. "But when I got there, he was already dead, and I don't know who did it. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't." Lydia's words trailed off, and for a moment there was only silence. Miss Marple could see the genuine terror in Lydia's eyes. She was clearly not the killer, but she had been part of something far larger, a conspiracy that had spiraled out of control. "I know you didn't kill him, Lydia," Miss Marple said softly, stepping forward and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But you know who did." Lydia's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Miss Marple took a step back, her expression hardening as the final piece of the puzzle slid into place. The guilt, the secrecy, the tension between the key players, it all pointed to one person. "Mr. Porter," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and resolute. "He's the one who orchestrated it. He had the most to gain, and he used everyone around him to get what he wanted." Lydia shook her head, disbelief washing over her face. "Mr. Porter? But he was like a father to me." "He wouldn't..." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Mr. Porter was far more than just a director. He was a man who couldn't bear the thought of losing control. Richard, with his charm and ambition, had become a threat to him, not just in the play, but in the power dynamics of the village. He needed to silence Richard before he revealed the truth." "But how..." Lydia's voice trailed off as she processed Miss Marple's words. Mr. Porter knew that Richard was close to uncovering something important about the village's history. He wasn't just a director, he was also an architect of secrets. He had connections that were far deeper than anyone realized. Lydia's hands trembled as she held onto the edge of the box, her face pale. "But why? Why kill him?" "Because Richard was going to expose those secrets," Miss Marple explained. "He was too close to the truth. And when someone like Mr. Porter has everything to lose, they will stop at nothing to protect themselves, even murder." Miss Marple's final test, Miss Marple's words hung in the air, the truth slowly settling into Lydia's consciousness like a stone in her stomach. The truth had been hidden for so long, and now it was finally coming to light. But there was still one final step to take. Miss Marple turned, her mind already several steps ahead as she prepared to confront Mr. Porter. She knew that he would be expecting her. He was far too confident in his plans, thinking that no one could outwit him. But Miss Marple had already proven that she could. As she made her way back to the village hall, her mind raced through the final pieces of the mystery. The game was almost over. All that was left was the confrontation. The village hall seemed quieter than before. The frantic energy that had consumed it earlier in the evening had subsided, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The police had combed through the premises, spoken to the witnesses, and secured what little evidence there was. Yet the mystery of Richard Cleary's death remained unresolved, like a puzzle with several missing pieces. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirlwind as she entered the hall once again. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, but there was still one thing left to do. The constable had already made his rounds, speaking to the villagers, and Miss Marple knew it was time to bring everything into the open. She moved toward the center of the room, where Constable Howarth stood, speaking to Mr. Green and the other prominent villagers. There was no sign of Mr. Porter, though Miss Marple had a feeling he was waiting, biding his time. He was far too self-assured to be caught off guard. He would confront her when the time was right, and Miss Marple was prepared. "Constable," Miss Marple called softly, drawing the man's attention. He looked up, his face weary but attentive. "Miss Marple, I was just about to speak with the others again. We don't have much more to go on. The doctor will give us his report soon, but there's no indication that Richard's death was anything other than, well, unexpected." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice steady. "It wasn't an accident, Constable. I can assure you of that." The constable raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her confidence. "What do you mean? Are you saying it was murder?" "Yes," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room, making sure everyone was listening. "Richard Cleary was murdered, and I believe I know who did it." The room fell silent. Everyone turned their attention to Miss Marple, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Mr. Green, standing by the back wall, looked as though he might challenge her words, but for now he remained quiet. The tension in the room was palpable. "I'm afraid the truth has been hidden for far too long," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but resolute. "Richard Cleary had discovered something important about the history of this village, and it cost him his life." Mrs. Sims, who had been sitting at one of the tables near the back, stood up sharply. "What do you mean, something about the village's history?" "I don't understand." Miss Marple glanced at her, her eyes sharp. Richard had been looking into some old records, things that had been buried for years. He was starting to ask questions. And I believe he was on the verge of uncovering a scandal that would have rocked this village to its core. There was a murmur of surprise among the gathered villagers, but Miss Marple didn't wait for them to settle. She turned toward Mr. Green, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "I believe you were the one who orchestrated Richard's death." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mr. Green's face turned pale, but he quickly regained his composure. He cleared his throat, his voice steady, though there was a hard edge to it. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Miss Marple," he said coolly. "I don't know where you're getting these ideas, but I assure you I had nothing to do with Richard's death." Miss Marple took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Oh, but you did, Mr. Green. You had everything to do with it. You were the one who had the most to lose. Richard was going to expose the secret you've been hiding for years? The secret about your involvement in the land deal, the one that destroyed so many families in this village." Mr. Green's face tightened, and for a brief moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? Anger? Perhaps both. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, and his expression returned to its usual hard, controlled demeanor. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low but firm. "I had no reason to kill Richard. Not a reason." Miss Marple echoed. "I would say you had every reason. Richard was about to expose the truth about the land deal. He was asking questions, digging into the archives, and he was getting too close to the truth. He could have ruined everything you've worked for, Mr. Green." The room was silent now, the villagers watching intently. "Miss Marple, had everyone's attention, and she knew she had to keep going. She had to make them see what she had already pieced together. Richard had already figured out that the land deal you were involved in was not what it seemed, Miss Marple continued. He knew that the land you had bought cheaply was once owned by families who were forced out under false pretenses. He was going to expose you, Mr. Green, and your involvement in that scheme. He had the evidence. Mr. Green's jaw clenched. His eyes darkened, but he didn't say a word. "And so, Mr. Green," Miss Marple went on, her voice gaining strength, "you decided to silence him. You couldn't risk him revealing your past." The constable was watching now, his brow furrowed as he processed Miss Marple's words. The other villagers were still, some exchanging uneasy glances, but it was clear that the truth was beginning to sink in. "Miss Marple," Mr. Green said finally, his voice tight with anger, "you're making a grave mistake. I have nothing to hide, and I certainly had no part in Richard's death." "Oh, but you did," Miss Marple countered, her tone unwavering. "You may have thought you were clever, but there's always a crack in the plan. Mr. Green, always a detail that betrays the truth. When Richard collapsed on stage, it wasn't just a coincidence. He wasn't poisoned, and he wasn't ill. He was shot." There was a collective gasp from the room, and Miss Marple could see the shock in the faces of the villagers. The truth was out now, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the bullet that killed Richard was small, easily concealed, and fired from a distance. It was fired by someone who had been on stage, someone who knew exactly when Richard would be in position, someone who had access to the props and knew how to use them." Her eyes locked onto Mr. Green. "It was you, Mr. Green. You were the one who fired the shot. You knew. You knew. Richard would be in just the right spot during the final scene, and you used the confusion to make sure no one would see what you'd done." Mr. Green's face twisted with fury. "This is preposterous," he spat. "I didn't kill him. I didn't," but Miss Marble's voice cut through his protestations. "The evidence was hidden in plain sight. Mr. Green, you thought you could control the outcome, but you underestimated the one thing you couldn't manipulate, the truth. And the truth is, Richard Cleary was murdered by you." The room was silent. No one spoke, and all eyes were on Mr. Green as the weight of Miss Marple's words sank in. The constable stepped forward, his face hardening as he turned to "Mr. Green? Mr. Green, I'm arresting you for the murder of Richard Cleary." The village hall was still as the constable placed handcuffs on Mr. Green, his face pale with defeat. Miss Marple stood back, watching the scene unfold. The mystery had been solved, and justice would be served. But as the constable led Mr. Green away, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of human nature, how easily secrets could be hidden, how greed and fear could drive someone to murder, and how, in the end, truth always had a way of surfacing. And so, the mystery of Richard Cleary's death was solved, but the questions of why and how would linger in the village long after the case had been closed. The morning after Richard Cleary's death, Little Hinton felt different. The air was thick with an unfamiliar tension, as though the village had been stripped of its veneer of tranquility. The usual quiet that hung over the cobbled streets was now charged with whispers, every passing glance and hushed conversation carrying a weight that hadn't been there the day before. The villagers, once innocent of any ill thoughts, now carried the burden of a secret that had been carefully buried until Richard had unearthed it. The arrest of Mr. Green had sent ripples through the village. The retired military officer, once a revered figure, was now seen in a completely new light. It was almost as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted. Miss Marple stood at the window of her modest cottage, looking out over the village with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The storm had passed, but she could feel the lingering unease in the air, as if the village was holding its breath, waiting for the finality of the resolution to settle in. She had spent the morning reviewing her notes, recounting the details of the investigation in her mind and thinking over the conversations she had had with the villagers. There was still so much to digest, not just the revelation of Mr. Green's crime, but the deeper secrets that had been uncovered. The land deal, the long-forgotten scandal, the way in which greed and ambition had woven their tendrils through the village's history. It was a tragic tale, one that would have consequences far beyond the confines of Little Hinton. The police were now in control of the investigation, and the coroner had confirmed that Richard had indeed been shot. The bullet had been a small, specialized round, and its trajectory suggested a shooter who had known exactly where to aim. The rest of the evidence, including the note found in Richard's pocket and the conversations overheard in the garden, had painted a clear picture of Mr. Green's guilt. Yet there was still something Miss Marple couldn't shake. She had always believed that the solution to a crime was hidden in plain sight, but now that the primary suspect had been apprehended, she found herself wondering if everything had truly been resolved. The quiet interrogation, later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit the constable's office. She had been expecting the usual deference, but Constable Howarth's face was etched with lines of exhaustion, as if the weight of the case had worn him thin. He greeted her with a weary smile, motioning for her to sit as he poured 2 cups of tea. "I don't know how you did it, Miss Marple," Constable Howarth said, his voice tinged with both admiration and frustration. Mr. Green seemed so certain of himself, so smug, we all thought we had him pinned. But the more we uncovered, the clearer it became. It was as if you knew all along. Miss Marple's eyes softened and she smiled faintly. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, Constable. It just needs time. The important thing is that it finally came to light." "But what about Lydia?" Howarth asked, his brow furrowing. "She seemed so upset, but I can't help but think she was more involved than she let on." Miss Marple considered the constable's question for a moment. Lydia Williams had been a key part of the puzzle, but Miss Marple had always believed she wasn't the mastermind. The young actress had been manipulated, coerced by Mr. Porter and Mr. Green into participating in the cover-up, but she hadn't been the one to pull the trigger. "I don't believe Lydia was involved in Richard's death beyond being an unwilling accomplice," Miss Marple said slowly. She was terrified, torn between her loyalty to Mr. Porter and the growing realization that the truth was too dangerous to ignore. "I think she was a pawn in a much larger game." "How did you know that?" Constable Howarth asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her fingers delicately tapping the porcelain cup. "Lydia's fear was obvious from the moment she spoke to me. She had a guilty conscience, yes, but it was guilt over her involvement in the cover-up, not the murder itself. She was too distressed by Richard's death to have been a willing participant. I think she had been led to believe that all she had to do was play along, and it would all be over." "How do you figure Mr. Green had the most to gain from all this?" Howarth asked, still processing the complexities of the case. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. Richard had discovered the land deal that Mr. Green had orchestrated, the one that had ruined so many families in the village. Green's role in that deal would have been exposed if Richard continued asking questions. He wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was protecting his livelihood, his power, and his secrets. How did he get to Richard, though? The man was well liked by the villagers. "The theater," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze sharp. Mr. Green knew that Richard would be alone on stage during the final act. He knew exactly where Richard would be and how to take him out without drawing attention. And with the chaos of the performance, no one would think to investigate the true cause of death until it was too late. "How did you know about the bullet, Miss Marple?" Constable Howarth asked, his voice tinged with awe. "That wasn't mentioned in any of the statements. It was only discovered later." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with a touch of mischief. "You must remember, Constable, that the smallest details often reveal the largest truths. The way Richard collapsed was too controlled, too deliberate. The mark on his chest was unmistakable once I knew what I was looking for. And then the hidden note in his pocket, which mentioned the garden meeting, it all came together." Howarth nodded slowly, processing her words. "You really are something, Miss Marple. But the village will never be the same after all this, will it?" "No, I suppose not," Miss Marple replied, her gaze drifting toward the window. The truth has a way of changing things, but sometimes that's necessary. It's not about making things comfortable, it's about setting things right. A village in turmoil outside, the village seemed to hum with quiet activity. The townspeople were going about their daily routines, but the shadow of the murder still loomed over them. The once serene and idyllic Little Hinton was now a place marked by betrayal and scandal. It was hard to imagine that the gentle rhythms of the village would ever be the same again. The arrest of Mr. Green had been the beginning of the end for the conspiracy. But there were still whispers, still questions lingering in the air. Mrs. Sims and Mr. Porter were both still under investigation for their roles in the cover-up, though Miss Marple had no doubt that the truth would eventually catch up to them. As well, the village would heal, she knew, but it would take time. And as the sun began to set over the quiet streets, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the complexities of human nature. People could hide their sins, bury their secrets, but in the end, the truth would always find its way to the surface. And sometimes it was the smallest of things, a glance, a word, a slight hesitation, that would reveal everything. As she prepared to leave the constable's office, Miss Marple turned to him one last time. "There's something else, Constable," she said softly, her voice thoughtful. "This case may be over, but remember that in every village there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered. It's just a matter of finding the right thread to pull." Constable Howarth watched her go, a sense of awe in his eyes. He had learned a great deal from Miss Marple, not just about solving crimes, but about the subtle ways in which truth and deception wove together to shape the lives of the people around them. And as Miss Marple walked down the cobbled street, her figure small but resolute against the setting sun, the village of Little Hinton slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The echoes of the past would remain, but the secrets that had almost destroyed it were now laid bare, and for that the village could finally breathe again. Days passed, and Little Hinton began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The arrest of Mr. Green, the subsequent investigation into Mr. Porter, and the quieter whispers that now echoed through the village hall marked the end of an era. The scandal that had once threatened to tear the community apart had been exposed. And though the dust hadn't quite settled, it seemed that life would continue. Yet, as with all things, the weight of the truth lingered like an unwelcome shadow over the idyllic village. Miss Marple sat in her modest sitting room, the crackling of a fire filling the space with warmth, but the flicker of the flames couldn't quite chase away the thoughts that had been occupying her mind for the past few days. Despite the resolution of the case, there were still parts of it that troubled her. Though Mr. Green had been arrested and Lydia Williams, the young actress, was no longer a suspect, the connections that had been revealed between the villagers and the murder were far deeper than Miss Marple had initially realized. She had taken to visiting the village more frequently over the past few days, catching snippets of conversation as she passed the market or sat on a bench at the village green. People spoke in hushed tones, of course, but it was hard not to. Notice the shift in the way they looked at her. There was a newfound respect, or perhaps fear, in the way they watched her pass. It wasn't the typical curiosity that people had when Miss Marple was in town. No, it was the weight of knowing that she had seen through their secrets. But it wasn't just the villagers' reactions that were on Miss Marple's mind. It was a lingering question of how everything had played out so precisely. The mystery of Richard Cleary's death had been solved, yes, but there was one detail that continued to plague her thoughts. She had never been entirely convinced that Mr. Green had acted alone, despite the evidence pointing toward his guilt. A new approach one afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece became a steady backdrop to her musings. It was during these quiet moments, with nothing else to distract her, that the smallest details often surfaced. There was something about the way Lydia had reacted when confronted that nagged at Miss Marple. Lydia had been terrified, of course, but there had been something more, a hesitation. A look in her eyes when Miss Marple had mentioned the land deal, something that suggested there was still more to the story. And then there was Mr. Porter, the director, who had seemed so calm in the face of the investigation, whose quiet demeanor had masked a complexity Miss Marple hadn't fully appreciated at first. She had been so focused on Mr. Green, so convinced that he was the mastermind behind the plot, that she had almost overlooked the possibility that Mr. Porter had been involved in more than just covering up the crime. What if he had been pulling the strings behind the scenes? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She rose from her chair slowly, smoothing her dress as she made her way across the room. She opened the door to find Constable Howarth standing on the other side, his expression a mixture of hesitation and resolve. "Miss Marple, may I come in?" he asked, his voice low. "Of course, Constable." "Please do come in," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. Howarth looked as though he had something heavy on his mind. He removed his hat and placed it on the small table near the door, and then sat down opposite Miss Marple, his posture tense. "I've come to speak with you about the case," he began after a brief silence. "I know we've closed the investigation on Richard Cleary's death, and I'm grateful for your help, Miss Marple. But there's something that's been bothering me." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Something you've noticed?" "Yes," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It's about Mr. Porter. I've been reviewing the statements from the villagers, and the more I look at it, the more I think we might have missed something." "Go on," Miss Marple said, her mind already starting to race through the possibilities. "Lydia, she told us she was only trying to warn Richard, but I think there's more to it than that. I spoke with her again this morning, and she mentioned something strange. She said she was trying to protect the family." "Protect the family?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice tinged with intrigue. "That's an interesting choice of words. Did she elaborate?" "Not much," Howarth said, his fingers drumming on the table. "But when she said it, her eyes flickered toward Mr. Porter. I don't know, Miss Marple. It's almost as if she's not just afraid of Mr. Green, but also of Porter. And then there's the matter of the letter Mr. Cleary was carrying. We didn't know what it said until after the autopsy, but it mentioned a meeting in the garden. Lydia was supposed to meet him there, and she was supposed to give him a message, but we're still not sure who the message was from." "Interesting," Miss Marple mused, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against her chin. "So you believe that Lydia may have been trying to protect Porter?" "I'm not sure," Constable Howarth admitted, "but I think it's possible. I've been going over the facts again and again, and I keep coming back to the same thing. Richard wasn't just a threat to Mr. Green, he was a threat to Mr. Porter, too. That land deal he uncovered, it involved both of them." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind whirling. It made sense. She had been so focused on Mr. Green's involvement in the crime, she had almost forgotten about the true extent of Mr. Porter's role. He had been the director of the play, the one who had orchestrated the drama that unfolded on stage. But he had also been involved in a much darker drama behind the scenes. If Porter was involved in the land deal, Miss Marple said slowly, then he had just as much to lose as Mr. Green, perhaps more. After all, Green was just the front man. Porter, as director of the play and a figure in the village, would have had a more significant stake in keeping the past buried. Howarth looked up, his eyes sharp. "You think Porter killed Richard?" "I think he was at the heart of the conspiracy," Miss Marple replied. "But I also think there's more to this than just a land deal. The question now is, what exactly did Richard find? And why was it so dangerous that it cost him his life?" The final piece, the evening sun had begun to set by the time. Miss Marple and Constable Howarth arrived at the village archives. They had made arrangements to review the records that Richard had been so intent on uncovering. The archive was dusty, filled with aging documents, old maps, and forgotten records that spoke of the village's past in hushed tones. Miss Marple had always believed that the answers were hidden in the details, and she was right. As she and Howarth sifted through the old files, they uncovered something that changed everything. A set of records that tied Mr. Porter not just to the land deal, but to a series of questionable transactions that involved more than just land. Porter had been using his position to manipulate property values, forcing families out and driving them into poverty in order to build a lucrative development. It was a scheme that Richard had likely discovered in his research. The details were damning, and if made public, they would have ruined the reputations of everyone involved. It was then that the final truth dawned on them. Richard had been killed. Not just because of the land deal, but because he had uncovered the dark secrets of the village itself. As Miss Marple held the papers in her hands, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much deeper story. But for now, the case was closed. Mr. Green and Mr. Porter's roles were clear, and the village could begin to heal from the tragedy. Little Hinton would never be the same, but perhaps, in the end, that was for the best. Days after the discovery. In the village archives, life in Little Hinton settled into a delicate rhythm. The village, once an idyllic picture of peace, was now forever changed. The murder of Richard Cleary had peeled back a layer of long-buried secrets, revealing a darkness that many had hoped would remain hidden. As the investigation wound down and the guilty parties, Mr. Green and Mr. Porter, faced justice, the village moved slowly toward normalcy. But there was a lingering sense that things could never be quite the same again. Miss Marple, ever observant and quiet, took to her usual walks along the narrow cobblestone lanes, her mind as sharp as ever. The quiet village had a way of making. One reflect, of drawing out truths from even the most stubborn hearts. While many villagers now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and cautious respect, Miss Marple herself felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction in having solved a crime that should never have been committed. The events that had transpired, the murder, the intrigue, and the web of deceit, weighed heavily on her thoughts. But even as the village began to recover, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was one more thread to pull, one more piece of the puzzle she hadn't fully solved. The village stirs. It was a crisp afternoon when Miss Marple ventured into the village square. The autumn leaves had begun to fall, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and crimson. The square, with its quaint little shops and cozy cottages, had once been a place of peace. Now, though, there was an undercurrent of wariness among the villagers. As she passed by the bakery, she overheard snippets of conversation, nothing. Too blatant, just hushed voices talking in the corner, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's a wonder no one else knew about it," Mrs. Delilah Sims murmured, adjusting her apron as she arranged fresh loaves on the counter. "The land deal?" A voice from behind the counter replied. "I can't believe it went on for so long. I always thought Mr. Green was too quiet, too. Careful." Miss Marple paused, taking a moment to listen, though she made no overt show of it. It was obvious that the entire village was still processing the events, still unsure about how to reconcile what had happened with the image they had of their once tranquil existence. As she continued down the lane, she noticed Mr. Porter's former colleagues from the Dramatic Society gathering outside the village hall. They were a quiet group, speaking in low tones as they awaited the arrival of the constable. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder about the toll all this had taken on them, too. For some, acting on stage had been the escape they needed from the monotony of their everyday lives. Yet now their performances seemed like a distant memory, a false facade that had been shattered by the truth. The constable had been busy. For the past few days, gathering more information and revisiting interviews, determined to tie up any loose ends. Howarth had become something of a fixture in the village now, his earnest demeanor and subtle curiosity making him approachable, yet respected by the villagers. Miss Marple had always believed that a good detective was not just someone who could observe the facts, but someone who could understand the human condition, the motivations, the fears, the desires that drove people to make the decisions they did, and in this case Howarth was proving to be just the right man for the job. The final piece, Miss Marple's instincts had been right all along. The core of the mystery had been simple, murder motivated by greed and fear. Yet, as she stood in the village square, watching the townspeople shuffle about, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper remained unspoken. The truth had been uncovered, but the true cost of the crime seemed to linger, just beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor at her cottage. A small knock at the door was followed by the unmistakable voice of Lydia Williams. Miss Marple, may I come in?" The young actress had been a bundle of nerves throughout the investigation, but now there was something different in her voice, a note of finality. Miss Marple opened the door and gestured for Lydia to come inside. The young woman stepped in, her movements still unsure but resolute. She had clearly been wrestling with something for days, and Miss Marple could tell that today was the day she intended to reveal the rest of the story. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Lydia began, her voice soft but steady. "And I know I can't go on pretending that I don't know more than I've told you." Miss Marple nodded, offering Lydia a place to sit. "Please, take your time." Lydia hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I told you that I was trying to protect Richard. I was scared of what Mr. Porter would do if he found out that I knew about the land deal. But there's more, Miss Marple. I was more involved than I ever let on." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "Involved in what, my dear?" Lydia swallowed hard, her eyes filled with regret. "I knew about Mr. Porter's plan. I knew about the land deal before Richard did. But Mr. Green, he was only part of it. It was Mr. Porter who arranged everything. He's been manipulating people for years, not just with the land deal, but with everything, the play, the village. He used all of us, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside her thoughts raced. "Tell me everything, Lydia, all of it." Lydia took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. Mr. Porter was angry when Richard started asking questions. He knew Richard wouldn't back down. But Mr. Porter didn't want to kill him, not at first. He just wanted Richard to leave it alone. But when Richard wouldn't stop, Porter said that they had to make an example of him. He told me I had to meet him in the garden to warn him that he was in danger. But when I got there, it was already too late." Lydia's voice cracked as she spoke, and Miss Marple could see the genuine distress in her face. "It was Mr. Green who took the final step. He shot Richard, Miss Marple. He killed him right there, just before the final act. Mr. Porter was there too. He watched it happen." Miss Marple's heart sank as she processed the new information. Mr. Green had been the one to pull the trigger, but Mr. Porter had been the mastermind behind it all. He had used his position as director and trusted figure in the village to manipulate people, leading them down a dark path. "I never wanted any of this to happen," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was too scared to stop it." The truth comes full circle. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against her cane. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, but it was a bitter truth to face. Mr. Green had been a pawn, manipulated by Mr. Porter's greater ambition. Porter's desire for control had led to Richard's death, and now Lydia's confession confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along. "I understand, Lydia," Miss Marple said softly. "You've done the right thing now. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried." Lydia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I just wanted to protect the people I loved, but I didn't know who to trust." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Lydia's arm, offering comfort. "You've trusted the right person now, Lydia, and in time, you will come to understand that the truth, though painful, is always worth it." As Lydia left Miss Marple's cottage, the old detective sat back in her chair, her thoughts turning once again to the village. The story of Richard Cleary's death had come full circle, but the village of Little Hinton would never be the same. The truth had exposed the hidden darkness of the past, and though it had been painful, it had also set them free. For now, at least. Miss Marple knew that in time the village would heal, but it would take a long while for the echoes of what had happened to fade. And until then, Miss Marple would continue her quiet observation, always ready to unravel the next mystery when the time came. Days had turned into weeks, and yet, despite the resolution of Richard Cleary's murder, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air of Little Hinton. The village had returned to its daily rhythms, the bakery once again filled with the sweet scent of freshly baked bread, the villagers chatting quietly at the market. The uneasy quiet that had settled in after the truth came out was now tempered by the knowledge that justice had been served. But Miss Marple knew all too well that some wounds took longer to heal, and not all the truths had been fully unearthed. While the villagers went about their business, trying to put the terrible events behind them, Miss Marple found herself walking the cobbled streets more frequently. The sight of the old stone buildings, the ivy-covered walls of the village hall, and the quiet corners of the market square seemed to pull at something deep inside her. She was drawn back to the puzzle, to the lingering unease that had clung to her throughout the investigation. The case was officially closed, but for some reason Miss Marple couldn't help but feel there was more to uncover. A final confrontation. One particularly crisp afternoon, Miss Marple was sitting by her window, gazing out at the soft autumn light, when there was a knock at her door. She didn't need to ask who it was. She had known this moment was coming. With a soft exhale, she rose from her chair and opened the door to find Constable Howarth standing on the other side, his face drawn and weary. "Miss Marple," he began, his tone heavy, "there's something I need to discuss with you. I thought I'd come by and speak to you before I head back to the station." Miss Marple nodded, her expression neutral, but her mind instantly sharpened. She gestured for him to come in. "How can I help, Constable?" she asked softly, taking her seat once more. "How much do you know about Mr. Porter's past?" Howarth asked, his gaze not quite meeting hers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "I know enough to understand that Mr. Porter was a man capable of far more than he seemed. He had a hand in the land deal, but his involvement ran deeper." "Than we initially realized? Why do you ask?" Howarth hesitated, glancing down at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at her, his face grim. "There's something I didn't uncover during the investigation. It was right in front of me, but I missed it until now. I didn't think to dig deeper into Porter's history, beyond the play and the land deal. But I've been reviewing old records again, the ones that pertain to the families that were displaced for the development, and I found something disturbing." Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did you find? How much do you know about his family?" Howarth asked, his tense. "Mr. Porter's father, Charles Porter, was a prominent figure in Little Hinton's development in the early 1900s. He was known for being ruthless in his business dealings, using every means at his disposal to acquire land and property. But there's something darker about him, something I only just discovered. According to old town records, Charles Porter was involved in an infamous scandal 20 years ago. There were rumors about him being connected to a series of mysterious disappearances." "How does this connect to Richard's death?" Miss Marple asked, her mind already racing. "The connection is more direct than I thought," Howarth replied. "When I dug into Mr. Porter's old records, I found evidence that his father had been linked to the land deal. Not just as a businessman, but as a manipulator, pulling strings behind the scenes to take over properties that didn't belong to him. Mr. Porter's own history of greed is rooted in his father's dealings. But I think there's more. I think Mr. Porter's fear of Richard wasn't just about the land deal. Richard had found something in those old records, something that could have exposed the Porter family's entire legacy." Miss Marple's thoughts were turning faster. "Now, so Richard didn't just stumble upon the land deal, he found something deeper. Something that could destroy Mr. Porter's family name." Howarth nodded slowly. "Yes, I think Richard was close to uncovering the full extent of Charles Porter's crimes. And when Mr. Porter realized Richard was digging too deep, he acted quickly to shut him up. I've spoken to a few of the older villagers, and they all remember the whispers about Charles Porter. But no one dared speak of it openly, especially not after his sudden disappearance." Miss Marple's face hardened as the pieces fell into place. So Mr. Porter's involvement wasn't just about keeping the land deal quiet. It was about preserving a legacy that had been built on corruption and deceit. "How do you think he would have reacted if Richard had exposed the truth?" Howarth asked, his voice somber. Miss Marple took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair. "He would have gone to any lengths to stop it, including murder." The final piece, the conversation had shifted the case into a new light. Miss Marple had already known that Mr. Porter was a man driven by fear, fear of losing his control over the village, fear of the past catching up with him. But this new revelation about his father's crimes added a layer of complexity to the entire case. Mr. Porter hadn't just been trying to protect himself. He was trying to protect his family's legacy, which had been built on manipulation and ruthlessness. Miss Marple stood up, her mind whirling with the new information. "There's something we need to do, Constable. We need to find out everything about Charles Porter's past and fast. There may be something in those old records that connects him to the disappearances. If we can tie Mr. Porter's actions to his father's, we'll have the final piece of the puzzle. How do you suggest we go about it?" Howarth asked, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "We need to go to the old town archives," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "There's no time to waste. If there's something hidden in those records, we need to find it before Mr. Porter can do anything else to cover it up." Howarth nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll gather the necessary documents and meet you there. We can't afford to let him slip away again." The revelation, by the time Miss Marple and Constable Howarth reached the old town archives, the sky had darkened, and the last of the autumn light was fading. The door creaked as they entered, the smell of dust and old paper filling the air. Miss Marple had been here before, but tonight the place felt different, charged, as if they were on the verge of uncovering something that had been carefully hidden for decades. Howarth wasted no time in pulling out the files related to the Porter family. Miss Marple had a keen sense for where to look, and after several minutes of rifling through the dusty papers, she found what they were seeking. In a small yellowed folder labeled Charles Porter, 1920s, there was a series of documents that caught her attention. They were dated just a year before Charles Porter's sudden disappearance. Miss Marple unfolded the papers carefully, her eyes scanning the documents. There, in the margin of a property transaction record, was a name she hadn't expected to see: Richard Cleary. Richard had been investigating this land long before he ever set foot in Little Hinton. "The final truth," Miss Marple whispered under her breath. Richard Cleary had uncovered his death long before it happened. The truth exposed, Miss Marple and Constable Howarth looked at each other in stunned silence. Richard had indeed discovered the connection between the Porter family and a series of disappearances tied to the land deal. The full weight of the truth had been hidden in those very records, and now, it was clear, Richard had been killed because of what he had uncovered. The truth was finally exposed. But as they left the archives, Miss Marple felt a deep sadness settle over her. Some mysteries, even when solved, left a scar on the soul of a village. Little Hinton would recover, but the shadows of its past would never fully fade. And as Miss Marple walked back into the village square, the quiet hum of the town surrounded her once again. But in her mind, the final piece of the puzzle had been put in place. The murder had been solved. The truth had been uncovered. The days following the discovery in the archives were oddly quiet, as though the village of Little Hinton was holding its breath, waiting for the final resolution. The truth about Mr. Porter's actions and the dark history of his family had left a mark on the village. Miss Marple, as always, was observant, but now there was a heaviness in her heart. The truth had been laid bare, yet it had done little to ease the disquiet in her soul. Despite everything, the village seemed to have a strange, almost palpable sadness about it. The people who had once greeted Miss Marple with smiles and waves now offered only polite nods, as if unsure of how to approach her after everything that had happened. Though they were grateful for the resolution of the case, the consequences of that resolution had left the town unsettled. It was difficult to reconcile the idyllic village they had once known with the darker truths that had been uncovered. Mrs. Marple had always known that beneath the surface of every village, no matter how peaceful, there were secrets waiting to be unearthed. But even she had been taken aback by the extent of those secrets in Little Hinton. What had once seemed like a simple case of murder had revealed an entire web of manipulation, corruption, and deceit, all leading back to one man. A final piece of the puzzle, on a cool morning, just as the last leaves of autumn were falling. From the trees, Miss Marple received a visit from Constable Howarth. He had been working tirelessly over the past few days, following up on the final details of the investigation, and Miss Marple could see the fatigue in his eyes. "I think we've reached the end of the road, Miss Marple," he said as he entered her sitting room, closing the door behind him. "I've just returned from a final round of interviews with some of the villagers. After everything that's come out, it's clear to me that no one really knew the full extent of what Mr. Porter had been up to, even his closest associates." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers lightly tapping her cane. "It's not uncommon, Constable. People often turn a blind eye when they want to protect someone, especially if that someone has been in a position of power for so long. How? Do you think the village will fare after all of this?" Howarth asked, his gaze steady but tinged with uncertainty. Miss Marple sighed softly, her eyes distant as she gazed out of the window. "It will take time. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The villagers will go on with their lives, but they will remember. The scars of the past are not easily erased, no matter how much we might wish them away." There was a pause, and then Howarth spoke again, his voice lowering slightly. "Miss Marple, there's something else. I've been reviewing the records on Mr. Porter's family again, the ones we didn't go through in detail before, and I found something I missed. It's not about the land deal or the disappearances, but it's significant." Miss Marple turned toward him, her curiosity piqued. "Go on." Howarth hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "The Porter family was involved in more than just business dealings. There's evidence that suggests Charles Porter had been involved in some highly unethical practices back in the 1920s, well before his son took over. The records indicate several questionable transactions, not only related to land but also involving the local government at the time. It's clear now that Mr. Porter's legacy wasn't just built on land deals. It was built on exploiting the system for his own gain." Miss Marple felt a deep sense of recognition. She had suspected that there was more to Mr. Porter's actions than just the land deal, but this new revelation confirmed that the corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. "Do you think Mr. Porter knew about this?" Howarth asked. "Do you think he was trying to cover up his father's legacy?" Miss Marple paused, considering his words. "It's entirely possible. Mr. Porter, despite his efforts to control everything around him, was clearly afraid of the past. He wanted to protect his father's name and his own, perhaps more than he cared about the village. The land deal, the play, the murder, they were all part of a larger web of deceit that he had constructed to protect himself. The past and the present, the revelations about Mr. Porter's family were troubling, to say the least. But Miss Marple wasn't entirely surprised. Over the years, she had seen how people could be shaped by their past, how generations of lies and secrets could build a foundation that was nearly impossible to break. Mr. Porter's actions, his manipulation of the people around him, were symptoms of something far deeper, a man struggling to keep a crumbling legacy intact. "Do you think Mr. Porter's actions will ever come to light?" Howarth asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I believe the truth always comes out in the end," Miss Marple replied softly. "Perhaps not in the way we expect. But the weight of deceit always finds a way to reveal itself. Whether the villagers will ever truly understand the full extent of what happened, that remains to be seen. But they will know, in their hearts, that things were not as they seemed. And that in itself is a kind of truth. How do you manage to remain so calm, Miss Marple?" Howarth asked, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and awe. "After all the darkness, all the manipulation and death, you seem so at peace." Miss Marple's eyes softened, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to reflect on the question. "I've seen much in my time, Constable. Life can be cruel, and people can be even crueler. But I've also seen how people can change, how they can come to understand the consequences of their actions. The key is not to dwell on the darkness, but to find the moments of light, however fleeting they may be. Even in the worst of situations, there is always something to learn." Howarth nodded, as though trying to absorb her words. He had always admired Miss Marple for her wisdom, but it wasn't until now that he truly understood the depth of her insight. A new beginning. In the days that followed, Little Hinton began its slow process of healing. The arrest of Mr. Porter, the exposure of the family's dark past, and the revelation of the true reasons behind Richard Cleary's murder had irrevocably changed the village. But despite the unsettling truths that had come to light, there was a sense of quiet renewal in the air. The villagers, though wounded, had a chance to rebuild their lives, free from the shadow of corruption that had plagued them for so long. Miss Marple, content with the resolution of the case, found herself turning her attention elsewhere. The quiet of the village, once oppressive, now seemed more peaceful. But even in that peace, she knew that mysteries would always be waiting, to be solved just beneath the surface. As Miss Marple sat once again by her window, watching the sun set over the village, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The case had been difficult, but it had been resolved with patience, understanding, and a steady hand. It was another victory for truth, though the cost had been high. And so Miss Marple remained, ever the quiet observer, ready for whatever mysteries the next chapter of life in Little Hinton would bring. The days drifted by in Little Hinton with a quiet calm that seemed almost unnatural, given all that had transpired. The autumn leaves had nearly all fallen, and the sharp, cool air was now settling into winter. The village, once shaken to its core, had started to return to some semblance of normalcy, but there was no denying that the events surrounding Richard Cleary's death had left a permanent mark on it. The villagers still whispered when they thought no one was listening, their eyes lingering on Miss Marple whenever she passed. She had become something of a local legend, not just for solving the mystery, but for her unwavering calm in the face of darkness. While the village had moved forward, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel the weight of what had been uncovered. She knew that, for some, the shadows of the past would never truly fade. Though the major questions surrounding Richard's murder had been answered, a lingering sense of unease remained. The case, though solved, was not one that could be easily dismissed. Miss Marple's mind often wandered back to the many conversations. She had heard the hidden fears of the villagers and the unsettling revelations about the Porter family's past. She had uncovered the truth, but the ripples of that truth were far from over. The unexpected visit. It was on one such afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window, lost in thought, that there came an unexpected knock at the door. The sound echoed through the quiet of her cottage, startling her slightly. She rose slowly, setting her knitting aside and walking over to open it. Standing in the doorway was someone she hadn't seen in days. Lydia Williams, the young actress who had been at the heart of the case, stood there, her face a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but firm, "may I speak with you?" "Of course, Lydia," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to allow the young woman in. "Please, do come in." "You look troubled." Lydia hesitated before entering, glancing around the room as if unsure of herself. She had been a key figure in the investigation, and though Miss Marple had always believed she had been more a victim of circumstance than a perpetrator of the crime, there was still something unresolved in Lydia's demeanor. After a moment's silence, Lydia spoke again, her words carrying a heaviness that Miss Marple had not anticipated. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Lydia began, her eyes looking far away as if lost in thought. "I can't shake the feeling that there's something more I should have told you. Something that I didn't fully understand at the time, about Mr. Porter and about Richard." Miss Marple, who had expected a conversation of some kind, but not one so laden with guilt and doubt, sat down in the chair across from Lydia. She gestured for the young woman to continue. "I've been so confused," Lydia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "When everything happened, when Richard was killed, I thought I understood. I thought I knew what was going on. But now, with everything that's come to light, I'm not so sure. I was scared of Porter, yes, but I think I also misunderstood some things. I think Richard knew more than I ever realized." Miss Marple regarded Lydia with quiet attention. "You've come to speak of something specific?" Lydia nodded slowly, her gaze now focused on the floor. "It's about the letter. The one Richard was carrying the night he died. When you mentioned it in the investigation, I realized I didn't know everything about it. It was more than just a meeting in the garden. It was something else. I think Richard had figured out that he wasn't just dealing with Mr. Green's land deals. There was something darker at play, something I couldn't see at the time. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on her cane. What exactly do you mean, Lydia? Lydia took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. Richard wasn't just trying to stop the land deal. He was trying to expose something that involved not only Mr. Green and Mr. Porter, but also some of the people in the village. There were connections between the old families here, families that had been wiped out during the land grab. Richard was going to find out who was involved in the cover-up, but someone didn't want that to happen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her thoughts spinning as the pieces began to shift. So Richard was closer to the truth than even you realized. What do you think he would have uncovered? Lydia hesitated. I don't know exactly, but he was looking into the families that had been displaced, and I think he had found something about Mr. Porter's father that tied the land deal to other illegal activities. I think that's what led to his death. Someone found out he was too close to the truth and decided to stop him. Miss Marple's mind was already piecing things together. This new information, while not a complete revelation, added another layer to the case. Richard Cleary had indeed been more than just a victim of greed. He had stumbled upon something much deeper, something that had tied Mr. Porter's family to even darker dealings. It was clear now that Mr. Porter's fear of exposure wasn't just about losing his position, it was about protecting the sins of his father, sins that had been hidden for decades. An unfinished story. Lydia, Miss Marple said gently, I believe you are right. Richard had uncovered something significant, something that would have destroyed more than just the land deal. It's possible that he had even learned about the illegal activities tied to the older families in the village, but there's still something we don't know. Richard's death was not only a murder, it was a cover-up. Lydia's face fell, the weight of the realization settling in. Do you think the village will ever really know the whole truth? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gaze far away. I think the truth is like a seed planted in the soil. It may take time, but it will eventually grow, no matter how deeply it's buried. The villagers may never fully understand the depths of the corruption that surrounded Richard's death, but they'll always know that something was wrong, and sometimes that is enough. Lydia looked up at Miss Marple, her expression a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I feel like I've failed him. I didn't stop it. You did what you could, Miss Marple said, her voice kind but firm. You were caught in a web of deceit, just as many others were. You made the right choice in coming forward now. Sometimes the hardest thing is to face the truth, but by doing so, you freed yourself from the weight of it. The road? Ahead, as Lydia left Miss Marple's cottage, the older woman sat in silence, contemplating everything that had transpired. The murder of Richard Cleary had started as a simple case of an untimely death, but it had unraveled an entire history of corruption, manipulation, and long-held secrets. The village would never be the same, but perhaps that was the price of truth. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window. The first snowflakes of the season had begun to fall, drifting gently to the ground, their delicate beauty a stark contrast to the darkness of the past that had been unearthed. The village was healing, but the scars would remain, hidden just beneath the surface. Yet, as Miss Marple stood there, watching the quiet snow settle over Little Hinton, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what she came to do. The mystery was solved, the secrets revealed, and the truth would continue to do its work, no matter how long it took. And for Miss Marple, that was enough. Winter had fully descended upon Little Hinton. The village, once vibrant with the golden hues of autumn, now lay under a blanket of snow, the rooftops dusted in white, the cobbled streets slick with ice. The cold had a way of making everything feel distant and untouchable, as though the earth itself had wrapped itself in a layer of insulation, keeping the past buried beneath the frozen ground. It was a fitting backdrop for Miss Marple's thoughts, which had turned inward again as they so often did after a case had been solved. The village had begun to heal, but there was still a sense of quiet discomfort among the villagers. No one spoke of the murder anymore, not openly, not in the way they once had. The whispers had quieted, and the most recent tragedy seemed to have slipped beneath the surface, tucked away like the forgotten corners of the old village hall. But Miss Marple knew that the truth had done more than simply unsettle the village. It had reshaped it. The dark undercurrents that had once driven the inhabitants were now exposed, and though justice had been served, the consequences of those revelations would linger for years to come. The constable had been diligent, wrapping up the last of the interviews, and the case was officially closed. Mr. Green, whose reputation had been shattered beyond repair, was now in custody, and Mr. Porter had vanished, his whereabouts unknown. But Miss Marple felt no doubt that his legacy had crumbled to dust. The village would move on as villages did, but there was no going back to the way it had been before. A return to normalcy. Miss Marple, however, found herself quietly observing. The world outside her cottage window had become stiller than ever, the horizon a blur of white and gray, the air crisp and biting. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones and made one long for warmth. But even as the snow fell outside, her mind had already shifted. There was still the matter of Lydia Williams, the young actress who had confessed her role in the events leading to Richard's death. Lydia had been a casualty of the larger scheme, caught in a tangle of lies and fear. Yet Miss Marple believed that the young woman had found a measure of redemption in her confession. She had come to understand the depth of her involvement in the tragedy and had sought, albeit too late, to make things right. It was this act of courage in the face of overwhelming guilt that Miss Marple had come to admire most in the girl. The weight of the truth had fallen heavily on Lydia, but now she was free from the chains of deceit. One afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter from Lydia, written in a carefully measured hand. She had been spending time in the nearby town, quietly rebuilding her life, but had returned briefly to gather her belongings. The letter was short, but sincere. Dear Miss Marple, I wanted to write and thank you for everything. I know I've made mistakes, but I also know that I'm finally at peace with the truth. The village will go on, and I will find my way. Your words and your guidance have meant more to me than I can express. Thank you for showing me the way out of the darkness. I will never forget your kindness. Yours sincerely, Lydia Williams. Miss Marple read the letter twice before placing it down gently on her desk. She had always believed that people were capable of change, that even those who had fallen into the deepest of traps could find their way out with the right guidance. Lydia had taken that first step, and Miss Marple was satisfied that she had done what she could to help her. But there was something else stirring in the back of Miss Marple's mind, a nagging feeling that she couldn't quite shake. The murder was solved and justice had been served, but it felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. There was always something more to uncover, some new thread to follow, no matter how small. The question that lingered most in her thoughts was not about the murder itself, but about the nature of the village itself. What did the truth cost? A conversation with Howarth. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the village in a soft, quiet hush as Constable Howarth came to visit Miss Marple that evening. He had been a regular presence in her life since the case began, and over the course of their many conversations, he had grown to respect her sharp mind and steady demeanor. There was something about her quiet strength that he found reassuring, a steadying force in the wake of chaos. Howarth knocked softly on the door before stepping inside, his face tired but thoughtful. He had always been one to wear his emotions on his sleeve, and Miss Marple could see the weight of the case still pressing on him. "Miss Marple, I thought I should check in on you," he said as he entered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "The village is quieter now, but I still feel like there's something hanging in the air. I don't know what it is. It doesn't feel like things are truly over." Miss Marple, who had been sitting by the fire, smiled gently. "I understand, Constable. The truth has been revealed, but sometimes the aftermath lingers. People don't always know how to handle what's been uncovered. It's not just the secrets that are exposed, but the way in which those secrets change everything." Howarth nodded, his brow furrowed. I've been thinking a lot about the way things played out, the villagers. They still haven't fully processed what happened. I think they feel like they can't talk about it openly, almost as though they're afraid to address it. Miss Marple took a deep breath, turning toward the fire. That's often the case when a community is shaken. People don't want to face the truths that lie beneath the surface. They fear that speaking too openly will rip open wounds that are too painful to heal. And in some cases, they might be right. Sometimes the truth is too heavy a burden to bear, and so they carry it silently. Howarth glanced out the window, his eyes distant. Do you think they'll ever really be able to move past this? I've seen them try to get back to normal, but I think they're all a little afraid of what might come next. It will take time, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. Time heals most things, though it leaves scars behind. The village will recover, though the memories of what happened will linger, even if people don't speak of it. And that's as it should be. Sometimes knowing that things are not as perfect as we'd like them to be is the first step toward accepting them. Howarth looked back at her, his face thoughtful. I suppose that's true. It just feels like there's so much more we didn't understand about Richard, about Porter, and about the land deal. I'm not sure any of us will ever fully understand what was at stake. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Perhaps not, but in the end justice has been served. That's all we can truly ask for. The rest, the past, will settle where it belongs. A quiet resolution. As the days passed and the village settled into the harsh quiet of winter, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case and everything it had revealed. The murder of Richard Cleary had peeled back a veil of secrets and lies, exposing the darkness that had simmered beneath the surface of Little Hinton for years. But in the end, the truth had won out. For Miss Marple, it was enough to know that justice had been served, that the guilty were being held accountable, and that the village, though scarred, would eventually find its way. People would move on, and the world would continue to turn. The village might never be the same, but Miss Marple had no doubt that it would heal in time. After all, even the deepest wounds could eventually close. As she sat by the fire, the soft glow of the flames casting shadows on the walls of her small cottage, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet peace. She had done what she set out to do. The mystery was solved, the past had been faced, and now the village would move forward. And with that thought, Miss Marple knew that she was ready for whatever came next. For in her quiet way, she had always known that the next mystery and the next truth was never far behind. As winter's grip tightened around Little Hinton, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations of the village. The snow had deepened into an unbroken white carpet, muffling sound and movement, giving the village an almost dreamlike quality. The villagers, though still haunted by the events surrounding Richard Cleary's death, had started to find their rhythms again, though it was clear that the events of the past had left marks that would not fade easily. Despite the outward calm, Miss Marple's mind remained restless. The case had resolved, justice had been served, but there was something in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The village had healed, yes, but it had healed with a deep scar that could not be undone. It was as though, in the quiet aftermath of the tragedy, the real weight of what had happened had not yet settled into the hearts of the villagers. One evening, as the fire crackled in her sitting room, Miss Marple received another unexpected visitor. This time it was not Constable Howarth, but a familiar face, Mrs. Delilah Sims, the village baker. Miss Marple had often passed by her bakery, the sweet scent of freshly baked bread and pastries wafting from the windows, and had exchanged the occasional pleasantry. But there was something different about Mrs. Sims's visit tonight. Her usual boisterous demeanor had been replaced with something quieter, more thoughtful. Miss Marple, she said softly, stepping into the room, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Mrs. Sims, Miss Marple replied with a warm smile, gesturing for the woman to sit. What brings you by this evening? Mrs. Sims seemed to hesitate for a moment before taking a seat, her hands clasped in her lap. I've been thinking about all that's happened, she began, her voice tight. I know it's been a few weeks since Mr. Green and Mr. Porter were taken away, but it still doesn't sit right with me. I feel like there's more to the story that's been left unsaid." Miss Marple studied her intently, sensing that there was more behind Mrs. Simms's words than she was letting on. "What do you mean?" "My dear," Mrs. Simms shifted in her seat, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "It's just, I'm not sure anyone really understands the full extent of what happened. The murder, yes. The land deal, yes. But there are things in this village that have been kept in the dark for a long time. Things that Mr. Porter and Mr. Green weren't the only ones involved in. The people in this village were all connected by something." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "And what is it you're trying to say, Mrs. Simms?" "I'm saying," Mrs. Simms continued, her voice gaining strength, "that there are more people involved in this than just Porter and Green. There are things, secrets, that have been buried for generations." And Richard Cleary, he wasn't just asking about the land deal. He was asking about things that go back much further than that. Things that nobody, not even the police, have looked at. The shadows of the past. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind processing Mrs. Simms's words. It wasn't the first time she had suspected that the truth was more layered than anyone had given it credit for. There was always more, too. A mystery than met the eye, especially when it involved a community as tight-knit as Little Hinton. The villagers, bound by shared history and unspoken alliances, often held their secrets close, unwilling to let the past be disturbed. But Richard Cleary, with his relentless pursuit of the truth, had uncovered something that had threatened the fabric of the entire village. Now, Mrs. Simms was suggesting that the murder, the land deal, and even the Porter family's involvement were only a small part of the story. There was something deeper, something darker at play, and Miss Marple knew she had to uncover it. "I think you're right, Mrs. Simms," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "There is more here than we've been led to believe. Richard's murder wasn't just about the land deal or Mr. Porter's family. It was about something older, something rooted deep in the history of this village." Mrs. Simms nodded, her expression serious. "It goes back to the original landowners, Miss Marple. The families who were pushed out when the village began to change. Richard was asking about them, about their land and what happened to it. People in this village have been profiting off the land for decades, and some of them have blood on their hands." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" "The original landowners, Miss Marple, they weren't just displaced. They were driven out. Some of them, I believe, even met with foul play," Mrs. Simms said, her voice low, as though she feared being overheard. "No one talks about it anymore. It's all been covered up. But there were things that happened long before Mr. Porter came along. People who had a vested interest in making sure certain families were erased from the village's history." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she absorbed the implications of Mrs. Simms's words. If what she was saying was true, Richard hadn't just stumbled upon the story of a corrupt land deal. He had uncovered something much older, a pattern of corruption and deception that had been buried for generations. This was more than just a modern scandal. This was the legacy of Little Hinton itself. The root of the darkness. Miss Marple stood up, her thoughts swirling. The idea that Richard had uncovered a long-forgotten scandal involving the early history of the village was a startling one, but it made sense. The land deal wasn't just a simple matter of property. It was a battle over the soul of the village, its history, and its people. Richard had unknowingly stepped into a minefield of secrets that had been passed down through the generations. "What do you think, Mrs. Simms?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. "Do you believe Richard was on the right track? Was he close to uncovering the full extent of the truth?" "I think he was," Mrs. Simms replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know all the details, but I do know this. There were families here. Families whose names you won't find in the records. They were erased, Miss Marple, wiped out. And now there are people who are still trying to keep it all hidden." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I'll need to go back to the archives then. There's more to find, I'm sure of it." Mrs. Simms looked at her, her face clouded with worry. "But Miss Marple, the more you dig, the more dangerous it gets. People don't want these things to come to light." They've spent decades burying the past, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." "I know, Miss Marple," replied her voice quiet but firm. "But the truth, Mrs. Sims, always comes to light eventually. And when it does, it has a way of changing everything." The final unraveling Miss Marple spent the following days revisiting the archives, combing through documents that she had previously overlooked. The village's records were dense with history, and for every piece of information she uncovered, it seemed there was another layer of the past that demanded to be uncovered. As she pored over the documents, it became clear that the land deals, the displacement of families, and the disappearances were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, more intricate web of corruption that had been woven over decades. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape, Miss Marple knew she was treading into dangerous territory. The past she was uncovering was a fragile thing held together by the careful silence of the village's oldest families. Every revelation she uncovered only made her more certain that the true story of little Hinton's past was far darker than anyone had realized. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. The past had a way of shaping the present, and the villagers of Little Hinton would soon have to face the truth of their own history, whether they were ready or not. And as she closed the archive's dusty ledger, she knew one thing for certain. This mystery was far from over. The truth, though painful, was finally on its way to being revealed, and with it, the village's future would be reshaped forever. The threads of truth. The cold wind had a sharp bite as it swept through the narrow lanes of Little Hinton, carrying with it the scent of frost and winter's approach. The village, now entirely shrouded in snow, seemed quieter than usual, its busy days suspended in a frozen stillness that mirrored the sense of unease Miss Marple felt deep inside her. The days had stretched into weeks since her conversation with Mrs. Sims, and although many things had been resolved, the land deals, Mr. Green's arrest, and Mr. Porter's flight, there was still something amiss. She had come to realize that the case was not entirely closed. It had simply shifted into something new, something deeper. The finality of Richard Cleary's death had caused the village to recoil in discomfort, but beneath that discomfort was a growing realization. The truth of the past, like a long-forgotten treasure, was slowly being uncovered, revealing the complexity of a village whose history was more entangled with corruption and deceit than anyone had known. Even after the last revelation had been made, Miss Marple couldn't shake the sense that there was more, that the pieces of the puzzle she had assembled still didn't fit together completely. Her mornings had become filled with more research. In the village archives, delving deeper into records that the villagers had long since abandoned, she had come to understand something crucial. The murder of Richard Cleary was not a singular event. It was the culmination of years, even decades, of concealed misdeeds, stretching back to the early days of Little Hinton's founding. It wasn't just about land or money, it was about power and control. And the more Miss Marple unearthed, the more she understood how dangerous it had been for anyone to try to challenge the status quo. A fragile truth. It was in the middle of one such investigation when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The knock on her door was hesitant, almost apologetic. She opened it to find Lydia Williams standing in the cold, her face drawn, and tired but resolved. "Miss Marple," Lydia began, her voice a mix of uncertainty and determination. "I know I haven't been in touch since everything happened, but I need to speak with you. There's something I've been thinking about, something I should have told you earlier." Miss Marple stepped aside, gesturing for Lydia to come in. "Please, my dear, I'm glad you've come. Sit down. I can imagine you've had a lot on your mind." Lydia entered and, after a brief pause, took a seat across from Miss Marple, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked as if she had not slept well in days, the weight of her past actions pressing down on her like an invisible burden. Her eyes, usually bright and lively, were shadowed with regret. "I don't know why I didn't come to you sooner," Lydia said, her voice shaking slightly. "After everything, I thought I could walk away from it. But the more time passes, the more I realize that there's something else I missed, something that could change everything." Miss Marple waited patiently, giving Lydia the time she needed. She knew the young woman was struggling, not just with the past, but with what she still felt guilty about. Lydia had, after all, been an unwitting accomplice in something much larger than she could have ever anticipated. But Miss Marple had always believed in the possibility of redemption, and that belief was what made her so determined to listen. Richard wasn't just looking into the land deals. He was getting close to something far more dangerous than we realized. I thought I understood what he was doing, but I didn't fully grasp the implications until now. What he was really after wasn't just the truth about the Porter family or Mr. Green. It was something far more unsettling. Lydia continued, her voice thick with emotion. I never understood the full scope of it, but now I know. Richard found something about the people who were behind the land grabs, the ones who benefited from destroying entire families to build their wealth. He was going to expose them. And I think that's what really got him killed. Miss Marple listened intently, her eyes sharp as she processed Lydia's words. You're suggesting that Richard's murder wasn't simply about the land, but about people who had a much larger stake in keeping the truth hidden? Lydia nodded, her face pale. Yes, I think Richard was going to expose not just Mr. Green or Mr. Porter, but a network of people who had been controlling things for years. The families who were pushed out of their land? They weren't the only ones. There were others who knew what was happening and allowed it to happen. Richard was close to understanding who they were, but before he could finish, he was silenced. The threads pulling together, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting on her cane as she reflected on what Lydia had just shared. This was the missing piece she had been searching for, the thread that would tie everything together. It wasn't just the land deal that had brought Richard Cleary to his death. It wasn't even just Mr. Porter or Mr. Green who had been involved. Richard had been chasing something larger, a conspiracy that stretched across the village and perhaps even beyond. The people he had been asking about were not simply landowners or businessmen. They were part of a long-standing system of power and exploitation that had been buried for generations. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more it made sense. The sudden, swift actions taken by Mr. Green and Mr. Porter, the extreme measures taken to silence Richard, had all been designed to prevent the unmasking of a deeper truth. This wasn't just about money or land. It was about control, about a network of people who had been pulling the strings in Little Hinton for decades. I think you're right, Lydia, Miss Marple said, her voice firm with resolve. Richard wasn't just an outsider looking in. He was onto something far more dangerous than any of us realized. Lydia looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and hope. Do you think we can still find out who was behind it all? Miss Marple stood up and walked to the window, her gaze drifting over the quiet streets of Little Hinton. The truth has a way of coming to light, Lydia. Sometimes it takes longer than we expect, but it will come. Lydia's voice was soft. As she spoke again, I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did. I was so scared, Miss Marple. But I think Richard would want the truth to come out, no matter the cost. People are capable of great mistakes, but they can also change, Miss Marple replied. And you, Lydia, have already begun that process. What matters now is that you've done the right thing. You've faced the truth. The final hurdle, as Lydia left Miss Marple's cottage, the weight of what had been revealed settled in. There was no denying the truth anymore. Richard Cleary's murder had been the result of something far more complex than she had originally thought. The connections between the Porter family, the land deals, and the people who had profited from the suffering of others went deeper than anyone could have imagined. The question now was, who else was involved, and how far did the conspiracy stretch? The final steps in the investigation would be the hardest. There were more questions to answer, more people to confront. Miss Marple felt that she was on the verge of uncovering the last piece of the puzzle, the final thread that would pull everything together, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The people behind the conspiracy would not give up their secrets without a fight. Yet Miss Marple was undeterred. The truth was out there waiting to be discovered, and no matter what, she would find it. As the winter night drew in, Miss Marple knew that the end of this mystery was still ahead, but she was prepared for whatever came next. The final piece of the puzzle, the cold had grown even sharper as the winter months stretched on, and the village of Little Hinton remained blanketed in snow. The days passed quietly, though Miss Marple's mind continued to churn with the recent revelations. The truth about Richard Cleary's murder had been pieced together slowly, but now, with Lydia's confession and the hidden history of the village, there was an undeniable sense that the puzzle was near completion. Yet as Miss Marple sat by, the fire, the crackling warmth contrasting the bitter cold outside, there was still a sense of something unresolved, something just out of reach. She had known for some time that Richard's death was not just the result of a failed land deal, nor merely the consequence of Mr. Green's desperation or Mr. Porter's fear. The forces behind it were much larger, and they stretched far deeper into the fabric of Little Hinton's past than anyone had realized. The day had been quiet, and Miss Marple had spent it sifting through her notes once more, reviewing the final points of the investigation. Despite the arrest of Mr. Green and the mystery surrounding Mr. Porter's disappearance, something was still missing. The web of deceit was unraveling, but Miss Marple knew there was one last thing to uncover, a final piece to the puzzle that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The last thread, as dusk settled into the village. The familiar sound of a knock at the door drew Miss Marple out of her thoughts. She stood and made her way to the door, her movements deliberate, though there was a quiet urgency in her step. When she opened it, she found Constable Howarth standing on the doorstep. His face was pale, his breath misting in the cold air. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with an unspoken tension. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Miss Marple nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The constable stepped into the warmth of the cottage, his gaze shifting around the room before he finally met her eyes. There was a weight to his presence, a sense of finality in his posture. "Have you found something new?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but her mind racing. Howarth nodded slowly. "I've been going through the final records we missed, some old town archives that hadn't been properly catalogued. I didn't think it would matter, but as I sifted through them, I found something that I think ties everything together." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, her eyes narrowing in anticipation. "What did you find, Constable?" Howarth took a deep breath, clearly wrestling with the significance of what he had discovered. There was an old will, a document that was never filed correctly. "It's from the early 1900s, and it's tied to the land that Mr. Porter and Mr. Green were fighting over. But it's not just about the land, Miss Marple. It's about who owns it, and why it's so important to the families in this village." Miss Marple's mind began to whirl as Howarth handed her the yellowed paper. It was an official document, though it had been tucked away and almost forgotten. The will belonged to one of the earliest settlers of Little Hinton, a man by the name of Tobias Finch, whose family had been involved in a land dispute long before the Porters or the Greens arrived. The will was dated and signed, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was the stipulation. Tobias Finch had left his estate, not to his children, but to a group of wealthy investors, men who had made a deal to secure ownership of vast tracts of land in the area. They had leveraged their power to seize control of Finch's land and cut out his heirs, a plot that had led to years of strife and resentment. The document outlined how the land was passed down and how certain families, including Mr. Porter's ancestors, had taken ownership of the land under false pretenses. Howarth's voice broke into Miss Marple's thoughts. Tobias Finch was the first in a long line of families who were taken advantage of. His heirs were pushed out, and over time, their claims were erased from the village's history. But Richard Cleary, he was starting to trace these roots. He was uncovering the family ties that no one wanted to remember, and I believe it's what ultimately got him killed. Miss Marple's fingers traced the faded letters of the will, as she could feel the weight of its history bearing down on her. This was the final piece, the last thread of the story that connected all the dots. Richard had been getting closer to something deeper than the land deals. He had been uncovering the very foundation of the power struggles that had shaped Little Hinton's future. "The land, Constable," Miss Marple murmured, her voice filled with quiet certainty. It wasn't just about property. It was about control, about erasing families, erasing the past, and creating a new narrative for the village. The power struggles here are not new. Not new. They've been happening for generations? Howarth nodded, his eyes widening with the weight of the truth he had unearthed. Yes, exactly. And Richard was the one who was about to expose it all. That's why they had to silence him. The legacy of deceit. As Miss Marple leaned back, the scattered fragments of the mystery began to lock into place. This was never only about Mr. Porter's determination to shield his family's heritage or Mr. Green's hunger for profit. It was about an age-old network built on falsehoods and manipulation. The Finch family's land had been seized, and those responsible had acted with the quiet assistance of corrupt figures inside the village. For generations, those truths had been buried deep, hidden beneath Little Hinton's carefully polished image of tranquility and prosperity. Richard Cleary had been the spark that threatened to ignite the truth. Without realizing it, he had begun stripping away the layers of history, uncovering a reality no one in the village wished to confront. "You see, Constable," Miss Marple said softly, "the murder of Richard Cleary was not a mere act of violence. It was the final chapter in centuries of deceit. Those in power, those who had built their fortunes upon stolen land and erased lives, could not allow him to speak. The truth. It was far too dangerous." Howarth's face darkened with gravity, yet his tone carried determination. "So the conspiracy reaches far deeper than we imagined. It isn't just about the land deal or the Porter family, it's about a legacy of manipulation woven into the very foundations of the village." Miss Marple inclined her head slowly. "Precisely. Now the question is this: how do we ensure the truth is never buried again? How do we make certain the people who suffered are never erased from history once more?" A final decision. Howarth's gaze softened. "I've thought about that too, Miss Marple. The villagers, the families who were driven out, they deserve to have their stories remembered. But I'm not sure how to make that happen." Miss Marple rose, moving toward the window, her eyes drifting over the quiet village street. "The truth finds its way, Constable, it always does. Perhaps it's time for Little Hinton to face its past honestly instead of hiding behind a shroud of silence." For a long moment, Howarth said nothing, then gave a firm nod. "You're right, Miss Marple. It will take time, but we can begin. We can tell the stories of those who were erased, bring their names and memories back into the light." "Missa." Marple turned back to him, a faint but warm smile touching her lips. "It may take time, Constable, but in the end, the truth is always worth the effort." And so Miss Marple knew that while the mystery of Richard Cleary's death had been solved, the real task, the mending of the village's wounds and the restoration of those forgotten voices, was only just beginning. Outside, snow continued to fall, but she felt that at last a small shadow over Little Hinton had been lifted.